What if the opening chapter of human history was written in a region where two large rivers converged rather than in Egypt or Greece? Imagine a place where the world's first civilization was bred by the waters of the Euphrates and Tigris, with soil so rich that it could feed thousands. Temple towers rise like mountains of mud, brick against a golden horizon. Farmers bend over irrigation canals, and craftsmen carve clay into tablets. Despite the heat and dust, life is alive here. This is Sumer, the place where the history of humanity began. History begins at Sumer is not a poetic device. It's literal. The Sumerians were creating the first cities, the first written words, and the first structured laws long before the pyramids of Egypt or the Athens philosophies rose to prominence. Their world signified the transition from nomadic tribes to organized societies, from survival to civilization. For the first time in history, human memory was etched into clay in this soil, becoming eternal rather than transient. Picture the landscape, endless plains stretching toward the horizon, bisected by two mighty rivers that overflow each spring, leaving behind rich silt perfect for farming. This area was inhabited by nomadic people thousands of years ago, who used the rivers, constructed canals, and turned the untamed area into the first cities in history. Names that once held authority, such as Uruk, Ur, Lagash, and Eridu, now hum softly from buried ruins. Walking on these lands is like walking on the pages of the oldest book ever written, where each grain of sand conceals a piece of the history of humanity. But why does Sumer matter to us now? Because a great deal of what we think of as modern was invented here, including writing, organized religion, law, astronomy, and city life. Every agreement we enter into, every clock we look at, and every calendar we adhere to are connected to systems that were initially developed more than 5,000 years ago by the Sumerians. Their 60-based numbering system continues to influence how we measure angles and time. Later traditions, including biblical tales, have echoed their myths. Without Sumer, our understanding of civilization would be unrecognizably incomplete. Despite their enormous accomplishments, the Sumerians are oddly forgotten in popular culture. Few people are aware of the people who constructed the very framework upon which Egypt's and Rome's empires were built. Despite our admiration for their wonders, time itself contributes to this quiet. Languages disappear, empires fall, and clay crumbles. Part of it stems from our unwillingness to acknowledge that civilization did not start where we believed it to, but rather in a location long obscured by forgotten conflicts and desert dust. Imagine realizing that ideas could endure beyond a single lifetime and being among the first people to etch a thought into clay. Everything changed in that instant. Stories may, for the first time, outlive the person who tells them. Beyond the range of their voice, kings could command. In the far heavens, priests could record prayers for the gods. We have never looked back since the world crossed an imperceptible threshold. Even though the Sumerian ruins are now silent, if you listen carefully, you can still hear faint echoes of the marketplace, hymns sung to soaring gods and young children learning to write their first signs. These echoes serve as a reminder that beneath the cacophony of the modern world, there's an age-old rhythm that we have unknowingly inherited. Our journey starts here. We are going to see the first cities ever constructed, get to know the first kings, and see how humans transformed memory into history. However, this is our story, not just theirs. The world we live in today was shaped by every brick they laid, law they carved, and prayer they muttered. This is the ideal time for you to join us if you're new here. To ensure you don't miss the next developments in this lost world, subscribe to Ancient Echoes. Additionally, you can support this exploration of truths that history nearly erased by simply tapping the Super Thanks button if you would like to. Help preserve these lost stories. Imagine a never-ending expanse of arid land and untamed grasslands, sliced by two meandering rivers, the waters of which shimmer in the merciless sun. The seeds of civilization first sprouted in Mesopotamia, the region between the rivers. Small groups of people started congregating here almost 7,000 years ago, long before the pyramids or the Greek temples. They were hunters and farmers, wanderers, drawn by the fertile soil left behind when the Tigris and Euphrates flooded their banks each spring. Over generations, these wanderers became something new. They became the Sumerians. Historians continue to debate their origin. According to some, they were native to this area and gradually developed from past farming communities that had figured out how to control the rivers. Others speculate that they may have arrived from far-off places in the east, bringing with them customs and a language that set them apart from their neighbors. Unrelated to Semitic or Indo-European languages, their tongue emerges abruptly in history, fully developed but distinct from all others. They seem to have brought knowledge that had never been seen before out of the desert. They shaped the land, and the land shaped them. The Tigris and Euphrates were both bountiful and perilous. They enriched the soil with silt, but also unexpectedly flooded, destroying homes and crops. These early Sumerians learned to cooperate in order to survive. Levees were raised, canals were dug, and the water was directed where families desired. By doing this, they made a significant discovery. People could create more together than they could separately. Initially, they lived in modest villages encircled by farms, consisting of small groups of mud brick homes and reed huts. However, these villages grew into towns as trade and harvests increased. The towns grew into cities, which were unprecedented in human history. Farmers sold grain and potters fashioned clay jars in their winding, narrow streets, which were packed with marketplaces. Goats bleated in pens, children played in courtyards, and smoke curled into the sky from cooking fires. Although life was chaotic, noisy, and lively here, it was also incredibly well-organized. At places like Eridu and Uruk, the first signs of urban life appeared by 4500 BCE. These cities served as administrative, commercial, and religious hubs, in addition to being collections of homes. At their center were temples that loomed over the plains and were stepped platforms known as ziggurats. From these heights, priests erected offerings to the gods, establishing a connection between divine favor and the people's survival. Below them, a new type of society was built on the shoulders of farmers and craftspeople, where work and faith were interwoven with everyday routines. The Sumerians changed the Fertile Crescent, not merely adapted to it. They transformed harsh floodplains into barley and date gardens by irrigating them. They developed tools, tamed animals, and mastered the use of mud brick to construct buildings that would last for centuries. Their homes were simple but cleverly designed to keep warm in the winter and cool in the scorching summers. Communities labored alongside one another in the fields during planting and harvest, timing their work to coincide with the rising of the stars and the flooding of the rivers. That they were unique in their culture. The gods that ruled over everything from grain to storms to the underworld itself were the focal point of their distinctive myths and rituals. Scholars are still perplexed by the linguistic isolate that their language had no relatives. Nevertheless, their beliefs regarding agriculture, law, and city life would extend well beyond their native land, impacting succeeding civilizations for thousands of years. Sumer's rise was gradual. It was the result of generations learning, adapting, and having the courage to do something no one had ever done before: establish a permanent home. For the first time, humans were changing nature rather than being at its mercy. Towns were formed from villages. Cities were formed from towns. Cities also brought with them something deeper: identity. People now identified with a place, a community, or an idea rather than just their family or tribe. You could hear the lowing of cattle, the clang of metal tools, and the commotion of merchants haggling over grain as you strolled through those early streets. You would witness priests carrying offerings up temple steps, children carrying water jars, and canals glistening in the sunlight. Every aspect of this new lifestyle marked a sea change, with humanity embarking on a journey from which it would never return. Our story begins with that of the Sumerians. They would create a world that would serve as the basis for monumental architecture, writing, and law. However, it was still brittle in these early days, susceptible to the vagaries of rivers and the hardships of life. Building cities was only one aspect of their ascent. Another was learning what it meant to be human in a world they were still figuring out. Thus the scene was prepared. From these modest beginnings, the world's first real civilization was about to emerge, one whose effects would be felt in all succeeding eras. Shut your eyes and visualize the first skyline that people ever saw. It wasn't glass or steel. The stepped temples that reached for the sky were atop mud brick towers that rose from the desert floor. At their base, the narrow streets were alive with activity. Oxen pulling carts full of grain, merchants shouting prices, children running between crowds, priests carrying offerings to their gods. This was Uruk, the center of Sumer and the cradle of the first cities in history. Mesopotamia had been a region of dispersed villages for centuries. Along the rivers, families built mud homes and reed huts on small plots of land. However, as trade networks expanded and harvests improved, something remarkable occurred. Villages started to combine. Small farming communities became vast urban centers. Canals multiplied and walls grew. The first great cities in human history, Uruk, Ur, Lagash, and Eridu, were the four names that stood out by 3000 BCE. Often referred to as the first city in history, Uruk was enormous for its time. Tens of thousands of people could be housed within its 6-mile-long walls. The city throbbed within those walls. Markets were brimming with goods, including exotic items brought from far-off places through trade, pottery made by talented artisans, and grain from nearby farms. The streets were congested and small, with people, carts, and animals moving all the time. Life in Uruk was a symphony of communal work, faith, and ambition as opposed to the remote huts of the past. These cities' architectural styles heralded a new era. The ziggurats, enormous stepped platforms made of sun-dried brick that rose far above the plains, were the most remarkable features. Temples devoted to the gods were erected atop these platforms, acting as both places of worship and markers of public pride. These tall buildings were visible to travelers from a great distance, their forms taking over the horizon. The ziggurat was more than just a structure to the Sumerians. It was a link between heaven and earth and a location where humans could interact with the divine. For its time, Sumerian cities' urban planning was astounding. To control the movement of people and goods, streets were designed. Neighborhoods were traversed by canals that supplied water for irrigation and drinking. Entire cities were surrounded by defensive walls, which were constructed to withstand attacks by rival city-states. Watchtowers maintained watch over the surrounding plains, and gates restricted access and departure. These were organized societies with levels of complexity never before seen in human history. Not just simple settlements. Within the city walls, hierarchy and cooperation coexisted. Although farmers remained the backbone of society, craftsmen, priests, scribes, and merchants also played a significant role. Craftsmen made tools and decorations. Priests kept temples and ceremonies in order. Scribes wrote down stories and transactions on clay tablets, and merchants carried goods and ideas between cities. Social divisions increased along with the growth of cities. The kings who claimed divine favor and possessed great power were at the top. Priests stood beneath them, then administrators, soldiers, and the working class. Everything changed with the advent of kingship. In villages, decisions about leadership were frequently made by priests or elders. However, the size of life in cities necessitated more powerful authority. In addition to leading armies to protect or enlarge their territories, kings coordinated labor for large-scale construction projects like city walls, canals, and temples. A number of these early monarchs were immortalized in legend, but none more so than Gilgamesh of Uruk, whose exploits were eventually chronicled in the world's first epic and sung for centuries. There was no physical separation between these cities. They engaged in wars over trade routes and fertile land, vying for prestige and resources. They also used the same cuneiform script, worshipped similar deities, and relied on comparable agricultural systems, among other cultural practices. The cultural mosaic produced by this web of city-states characterized Sumer and established the framework for succeeding empires. The cities of Sumer had a thriving and diverse social scene. The calendar was jam-packed with festivals honoring planting, harvests, and the gods that governed them. Markets were bustling, with vendors negotiating prices and storytellers entertaining audiences with songs and myths. Offerings were gathered and redistributed from temples, which functioned as centers of both religion and commerce. Families resided in small houses grouped together along narrow streets, frequently featuring courtyards where daily activities and social events were held. Cooperation was essential for survival, privacy was scarce, and life was communal. Moving from a village to a city also presented new difficulties. Disease could spread swiftly in crowded areas. Communities were forced to increase irrigation and trade due to resource demand, which occasionally resulted in disputes with neighbors. The first scribes and written documents emerged as a result of the need to keep records in order to manage these complexities. The accomplishments of Sumer were able to outlive the people themselves because clay tablets preserved everything from grain inventories to epic poetry. What made these cities revolutionary wasn't just their size, it was the mindset they created. People began to perceive themselves as belonging to something greater than their tribe or family for the first time. They shared a common identity as members of a city, which sparked civic pride and group aspirations. Beyond just being made of stone and mud, Uruk's walls served as a testament to the fact that humanity had entered a new era. By the height of Sumerian civilization, these cities were among the most advanced places on Earth. They possessed prosperous economies, codified laws, colossal architecture, and well-functioning governments. Their inventions, such as the wheel and written language, would influence human history and spread well beyond Mesopotamia. But despite their beauty, these cities were still at risk. Their wealth fluctuated in tandem with the rivers, conflicts, and aspirations of competing monarchs. The first urban revolution in human history occurred with the rise of Sumerian cities, which represented a transition from dispersed villages to sophisticated societies capable of planning, constructing, and surviving. It seemed as though history itself had taken a different turn when standing on the walls of Uruk and gazing out over the fields, canals, and temples. Nothing would be the same in the world. What if the first words ever written by humans were numbers, rather than poems, stories, or prayers? Imagine a busy Uruk market where scribes sit next to clay tablets, merchants shout prices over sacks of barley, and commerce hums in the air. A single silent invention altered everything amid that cacophony. Wet clay is pressed into a reed, a mark, a document. The beginning of writing. The first written signs were created out of necessity long before alphabets or novels. The cities of Sumer had become too big for memory to handle. Priests counted offerings to the gods, merchants exchanged goods from far-off places, and farmers brought grain to storehouses. People needed a way to stay on top of things. Verbal agreements were no longer enough. The earliest clay tablets, which were rudimentary pictographs etched into moist mud and recorded amounts of grain, livestock, and labor due, thus emerged circa 3200 BCE. Rather than being poetic, these early records were utilitarian. One wedge-shaped mark could represent sheep, another 10, and so on, forming lists and tallies that enabled the city to operate. Over time, this system evolved. The signs became more adaptable and the pictographs more abstract. Cuneiform. so called because of the wedge-shaped impressions created by pressing a reed stylus into clay, was created by the Sumerians by 3000 BCE. It was a clever process. While still wet, clay, which was plentiful in Mesopotamia, was formed into flat tablets. The stylus was a sharpened reed that was cut from riverbanks. By pressing angled marks into the clay, the scribe produced a script that could be read after baking or drying. These tablets preserved voices from a world that would have otherwise been lost to dust for millennia. Unlike ink on papyrus, writing was initially used for administration and trade, including the recording of contracts, taxes, and rations. However, the system evolved into something more. Laws, hymns, and myths were all documented by scribes. They composed inventories for temples and correspondence between kings. The Epic of Gilgamesh, the first work of literature in human history, started out as marks on clay. Writing in Sumer advanced from counting sheep to narrating tales of heroes and gods. Writing changed society. For the first time, knowledge could outlive the knower. Concepts could now be shared, researched, discussed, and expanded upon. They no longer died with the speaker. To train scribes, cities established demanding schools, where students practiced until their hands hurt and learned hundreds of signs by heart. Although these schools were challenging, the benefits were enormous. Scribes held authority as recorders of the law and custodians of memory because literacy was rare and valuable. Scribe life was both honorable and demanding. A young boy could practice carving straight lines into clay for years, copying lists of words and phrases until he got it just right. Although his education was rigorous and his teachers were quick to correct errors, it provided him with opportunities for historical immortality, royal administration, and temple service. In order to ensure that future generations would understand what was owed, what was promised, and what was sacred, every tablet he wrote became an integral part of the city. A change in human thought itself was reflected in the move from pictographs to abstract symbols. Writing initially mimicked reality, using a drawing of a sheep for sheep and a jar for grain. However, over time, the marks evolved into symbols for sounds and concepts, releasing language from the constraints of images. Poetry, legal codes, and royal decrees were all made possible by this leap. The focus shifted from counting goods to documenting the human experience. Think about how big this change is. History existed solely in oral tradition and memory prior to writing. It was brittle and altered with each recounting. Memory was fixed after writing. Events, dates, and myths could all be documented. A prayer could span centuries, and a king's actions could outlive his body. The age of history was the new dimension that humanity had entered. Cuneiform's legacy is astounding. It continued to be the most widely used writing system in Mesopotamia for more than 3 millennia. First by the Sumerians and then by the Akkadians, Babylonians, and Assyrians. Its impact extended beyond language, influencing education, administration, and even the arts. The wedge-shaped script appeared on everything from humble receipts to monumental stone inscriptions proclaiming royal victories. However, cuneiform's permanence was arguably its greatest gift. Archaeologists have rediscovered thousands of these clay tablets that have survived, buried beneath the sands. Through them, we hear voices that would not otherwise be heard, such as a priest recording omens from heaven, a father writing to his son, or a merchant grumbling about late payments. Every tablet bridges the gap between their world and ours by acting as a time capsule. Writing was not merely an invention when it first appeared in Sumer. Rather, it was a philosophical revolution. It made it possible for people to speak to the future and transcend the present. A Sumerian scribe could not have predicted that his marks would reverberate for millennia, carrying the earliest echoes of civilization into the modern era when he pressed his stylus into wet clay. However, they did. With the help of a wedge, a tablet, and the silent genius of the Sumerians, we are able to trace our history back to the very beginning. Imagine yourself at dawn, standing at the base of a tall ziggurat. Drums reverberate through the streets. Hundreds of people assemble with their faces turned upward toward priests ascending the steps, and the air is thick with incense. Grain, wine, and animal sacrifices are made at the summit for the invisible, gods who are thought to control all of nature's forces. The divine was not far away in Sumer. It was present in every windstorm, harvest, and flood. The Anunnaki, the enigmatic pantheon of gods whose names continue to reverberate in myths thousands of years later, were at the core of this belief. The Sumerians thought of their gods as strong but emotionally very human. Anu, the Sky Father, king of the gods and ruler of the heavens, was at the head of this divine hierarchy. Although he had absolute power, he rarely interfered in mortal affairs, instead giving his children authority. Among them was Enlil, the god of storms and air, who ruled over kingship and the law in addition to wind and weather. Enlil was both a protector and a destroyer to the Sumerians. He was the one who bestowed life but also had the capacity to wreak havoc. Then came Enki, the creator, the wise one, and the lord of water. In contrast to Enlil's harsh and dominant demeanor, Enki was regarded as shrewd and kind, frequently assisting humanity in myths where the other gods sought retribution. Sumerian flood stories, which are remarkably similar to the later biblical story of Noah, claim that Enki forewarned mortals of an approaching deluge. The gods in these myths argue over humanity's destiny, and their choices have an impact on future generations. The goddess of fertility, love, and war, Inanna, later known as Ishtar, was one of the most intriguing characters. She was the epitome of paradoxes, nourishing yet destructive, alluring yet vicious. Inanna's journey into the underworld is depicted in myths as a deity who isn't afraid to confront death itself, displaying a depth that is uncommon in later, simplified pantheons. The Sumerians used her to examine themes of desire, power, and life-death cycles. Sumerian cities were centered on temples, which served as both commercial and religious hubs. The ziggurats, which were enormous stepped platforms that rose far above the plains, were the most magnificent of these. Constructed using mud bricks, they served as symbolic stairways connecting the earth and heaven and could be seen for miles. Priests carried out complex rites atop these buildings, including offering sacrifices, pouring libations, chanting hymns, and burning incense to win the gods' favor. The entire community participated in these rituals, which strengthened the ties that bind people, the city, and the gods. Consumer, religion permeated every aspect of daily life and was not limited to acts of worship. Everything was believed to be under the gods' control, from disease and war to rainfall and crop growth. Kings claimed legitimacy through their relationship with the gods, ruling not only as political leaders, but also as divine representatives. Moral order resulted from appeasing the pantheon, and laws were presented as divine decrees. In a way, to disobey a king was to disobey heaven. The Anunnaki, however, are a mystery that remains a topic of discussion despite these myths and rituals. According to ancient writings, they are strong gods who came from Anu and reside in both heaven and earth. Outside of academic circles, some scholars have put forth far more controversial theories, while others interpret them as mythological personifications of natural forces. Some contemporary interpretations, made popular by authors like Zechariah Sitchin, hold that the Anunnaki were not just gods but also extraterrestrial visitors, highly developed creatures that the ancient people mistook for gods. Even though mainstream historians reject these theories, they nevertheless arouse interest and conjecture, particularly among those looking for different explanations for the abrupt advance of human civilization in Sumer. The depth of the Sumerian myths is astounding even in the absence of these contemporary theories. Later Mesopotamian and biblical traditions contain echoes of creation stories in which gods, shape humans out of clay to perform divine labor. The famous flood story, which has been preserved in writings such as the Epic of Atrahasis and later the Epic of Gilgamesh, describes a devastating deluge that follows divine wrath against humanity for its noise and disobedience. These themes, divine, creation, punishment, and redemption, became the basis for innumerable myths in many different cultures. It is impossible to overestimate the impact of these religious concepts. Later civilizations were shaped by the Sumerian moral codes, rituals, and cosmic order. Babylonian, Assyrian, and even Hebrew traditions all borrowed heavily from these early ideas. Sumer's combination of religion and government is responsible for the development of ideas like written law, temple-centered worship, and divine kingship. You could hear chants rising from temple courtyards, see processions carrying statues of the gods, and sense the collective devotion of thousands of people strolling through a Sumerian city on a festival day. Every action was sanctified by ritual, including planting, building, and trading. The very act of living was an offering, a continual negotiating with forces outside of human control. The Anunnaki were intimate and yet distant in this divine drama. In myth, they walked among mortals while shaping destinies. In addition to bestowing kingship, they also let plagues loose. The Sumerians believed that the gods were a cosmic reflection of humanity's own virtues and vices. They discovered order, meaning, and fear in that contemplation. Beyond just ancient mythology, the tale of Sumer's gods represents the earliest attempt to comprehend existence itself. It is the first known human conversation with the unknown. And it is still going on today in different forms. Gaze up at the night sky. The same stars that you see today led Sumerian farmers, priests, and kings thousands of years ago. They measured, computed, and documented instead of merely staring in awe. The Sumerian people discovered patterns in the heavens and numbers beneath the soil long before telescopes and modern science, establishing the groundwork for modern life. The Sumerian sexagesimal system, a base 60 numbering scheme, was their greatest mathematical accomplishment. They counted in 60s, whereas we count in 10s. The concepts of 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, and 360 degrees in a circle became so ingrained in their thinking that they still hold on to it today. What started out as a field and trade management tool evolved into a universal framework for space and time. Y60. According to academics, it provided flexibility. Calculations are useful for everything from dividing land to monitoring celestial cycles, because 60 can be divided evenly by a variety of numbers, including 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, and 30. Scribes created a sophisticated, scalable system for ones and tens on clay tablets by combining wedge marks. They used it to precisely plan monumental buildings, build canals, and calculate harvest yields. However, their brilliance extended beyond mathematics. Sumerian astronomers and priests looked up at the sky, mapping out the motions of planets and stars. They meticulously documented the predictable movements of Venus, Jupiter, and Saturn across the night sky. These observations had a direct connection to ritual and agriculture, so they weren't just idle curiosity. In addition to warning of floods and indicating the planting and harvesting seasons, celestial events were thought to represent the gods' moods. This combination of necessity and observation led to the creation of the Sumerian calendar in order to coordinate festivals and agricultural work with the waxing and waning moons. They separated the year into lunar months. In order to keep plantings and harvests in line with the seasons, they eventually figured out how to modify their calendar to correspond with the solar year. They were able to forecast natural rhythms that were essential to their survival because of their mastery of cycles, both terrestrial and celestial. Their architecture was also influenced by mathematics, with their symmetrical tiers and exact Alignments, the enormous ziggurats necessitated meticulous planning and measurement. Using instruments like plumb bobs and measuring cords, builders determined dimensions, angles, and load-bearing capacities. In order to guarantee that water flowed evenly to far-off fields, canals were designed to maintain constant gradients. Mathematical thought turned mud and sweat into lasting monuments in every brick laid and wall raised. Calculation marks were even visible on everyday tools. In busy marketplaces, fair trade was made possible by standardized weights and measures. Early accounting tools that predated written numerals were clay tokens and bulla, which are sealed clay envelopes. These norms promoted trust as trade networks grew, which is an essential first step toward complex economies. What is perhaps most astounding is the extent to which their insight spread. Sumer's base 60 system was passed down to the Babylonian and later Greek mathematicians who incorporated it into Western philosophy. Every time we look at a clock or use a compass, we are repeating a choice made on the banks of the Euphrates. 5,000 years ago, they also left a significant legacy in astronomy. Babylonian astrology, which in turn influenced Greek and Roman celestial studies, was influenced by Sumerian star catalogs. Our night skies are still marked by constellations with Mesopotamian names. Even contemporary science, devoid of its historical religious background, builds upon the information initially collected by these early observers. There was no clear separation between religion and science in Sumer. Numbers were both useful tools and holy symbols. The stars were both celestial bodies and divine signs. Priests observed the skies in order to decipher divine messages as well as to map eclipses. In the same way that irrigation was planned, temple offerings were calculated using mathematics. The very nature of knowledge was holistic. It was a web in which practical and divine concerns were interwoven. Sumerian science excelled in application rather than abstract theory. They planned festivals, irrigated fields, and constructed cities based on their calculations. They turned chaos into order by weaving observation into survival. By doing this, they initiated humanity's initial steps toward comprehending the cosmos, which we still take today, frequently without recognizing it. The stars are as bright now as they were thousands of years ago as night descends on the ruins of Ur or Eridu. We catch a glimpse of the lasting legacy of a people who looked up, counted, and started measuring eternity somewhere between those silent ziggurats and the boundless sky. Imagine a society in which a written code, rather than personal retaliation, is used to resolve all conflicts, from stolen grain to broken marriages. A place where justice is etched in stone for everyone to see, rather than being random. Centuries before the renowned laws of Hammurabi, that world was born in Sumer. Here, humanity took its first step toward organized law and governance. The city of Ur was one of Sumer's jewels. By 2100 BCE, King Ur-Nammu's reign presented society with a new problem: how to keep the peace in a complicated, quickly expanding urban environment. Once elderly and customary villages had become thriving metropolises with thousands of residents, a wide range of occupations, and escalating conflicts. Disputes could no longer be settled consistently or fairly by oral tradition alone. The first known legal code in human history was Ur-Nammu's groundbreaking response. Engraved onto clay tablets, the Code of Ur-Nammu predates Hammurabi's more well-known code by centuries. Even though only pieces have survived, they show a powerful picture of justice. The laws are the oldest surviving attempt to codify social norms because they are written in Sumerian rather than Akkadian. They specify penalties and sanctions for offenses ranging from assault and theft to adultery and fabricating testimony. Ur-Nammu's laws tended toward monetary compensation, with fines paid in silver rather than blood, in contrast to later codes that frequently called for the death penalty for numerous offenses. This method demonstrates a practical view of justice. The law looked for solutions that brought social harmony back, rather than never-ending cycles of family retaliation. A thief may reimburse the victim. A false accuser may be subject to the same punishment. A common sense of right and wrong that transcends personal resentment was established by the code by establishing predictable results. The fact that such a code exists also illustrates how kingship has changed over time. According to Sumerian belief, kings were appointed by the gods and tasked with upholding civic and cosmic order. Ur-Nammu framed himself as both a ruler and a servant of justice, presenting his laws as having been approved by God. The code was given weight by this divine authority. Following the king's rules was regarded as being in accordance with heaven's will. However, kings did not rule by themselves. Priests were essential to administration because they managed offerings, kept an eye on temple property, and arbitrated conflicts. Temples ruled over enormous resources and labor forces in addition to being places of worship. Secular and sacred were intertwined in Sumerian governance, which was a collaboration between palace and temple. This relationship was formalized by the code, which incorporated civic duty with religious obligations. Equally important was the social hierarchy that the code represented. The legal status of slaves, dependent laborers, and free citizens varied. In Sumerian society, depending on the victim's status, different penalties may be imposed for the same offense. Although this might appear unfair to contemporary eyes, it was an early attempt to balance social roles by recognizing the rights and responsibilities of all social classes rather than relying solely on force to administer justice. During this time, organized law enforcement started to take shape. The king appointed city officials to serve as administrators and judges. Public gatherings were occasionally held to observe trials or approve rulings, fusing local custom with centralized power. Accountability was guaranteed by written records, which allowed for consistent case reviews, penalty confirmations, and dispute resolution that was unthinkable in purely oral systems. This transition to codified law represented a significant change in human thinking rather than merely an administrative expediency. Justice was externalized for the first time. It was set aside from personal preferences and given a permanent form. The law evolved into a benchmark by which both the ruled and the ruler could be evaluated. It suggested that even monarchs were subject to the values they declared. At least figuratively, the foundation for subsequent legal traditions was also established by the Code of Ur-Nammu. Babylonian, Hebrew, and Roman law would all incorporate ideas like property rights protection, restitution for injuries, and proportionate punishment. These clay tablets from ancient Sumer are even the source of the notion that written agreements, such as contracts, decrees, and constitutions, govern society. Imagine a citizen approaching a temple courtyard with a clay tablet in hand and making an appeal to a scribe. The scribe pays close attention, takes note of the grievance, and references the pertinent legislation. Priests confer, officials observe, and a ruling is issued, not as a favor, but as a formal order. For the first time, fairness is a lasting promise etched in clay rather than just the ruler's attitude. Sumer's legal revolution thus followed in the footsteps of its other innovations in writing, urbanization, and mathematics. Every innovation represented a new way of thinking. Structured governance replaced tribal authority, shared law replaced personal vengeance, and collective memory replaced oral tradition. The goal of the code was to define what it meant to coexist in a city under laws that were more important than any one person's, rather than just punishing criminal activity. Asterisk, whether we realize it or not, we are speaking in the shadow of Ur-Nammu's clay tablets when we discuss modern civilization, including courts, contracts, and constitutions. The same message is still conveyed by those straightforward wedge marks that were made in wet mud almost 4,000 years ago. The pursuit of justice is as old as history itself. What if the first story ever recorded by humans was about a king who was trying to figure out how to live forever? Imagine a king so powerful that his name could be heard in marketplaces and temples, but even he would perish. One of the most eerie traces of Sumerian art and literature is the story of Gilgamesh, which was carved into clay 4,000 years ago. Most people agree that the Epic of Gilgamesh is the oldest surviving epic in the world. It tells the story of Gilgamesh, the semi-divine king of Uruk, and was first written in Sumer before being preserved by Babylonian scribes. He is portrayed as both a hero and a tyrant at the start of the story because of his unparalleled strength and ambition. Enkidu, a crazed man made to degrade him, is the god's response to his conceit. What emerges is a close friendship, one so strong that Gilgamesh is driven to a desperate attempt to defeat death itself by its devastating loss. Gilgamesh faces important issues during this voyage, such as why people die. Is it ever possible to become immortal? Is leaving a legacy the only way to live forever? One of its most well-known episodes features Gilgamesh meeting Utnapishtim, a great flood survivor who resembles Noah in the Hebrew Bible. Among the numerous themes in Sumerian literature that later resurface in Biblical and Greek traditions is this flood story, which describes divine wrath and a chosen survivor. Additionally, the epic provides insights into common Sumerian beliefs. It talks about burial customs, temple rites, and perceptions of the underworld, a desolate shadow world where all souls, no matter how noble, live in dust. Both grandeur and fragility are depicted in its poetry. Gods who mold destinies and mortals who search for purpose in them. However, Gilgamesh was only a small portion of Sumer's thriving literary and artistic culture. During festivals and temple rituals, lyres and drums were used to perform poetry and music that filled their cities. While laments lamented lost cities following floods or wars, hymns extolled gods and monarchs. These songs served as acts of devotion and remembrance that passed culture down through the generations, and they were more than just entertainment. Alongside literature, art flourished. Mythological scenes, divine symbols, and everyday life were portrayed in Sumerian carvings and cylinder seals, which are tiny, finely engraved stones used to stamp clay. These pictures had both utilitarian and religious functions, such as celebrating successes, indicating ownership on papers, or requesting protection from gods. The walls of the temple featured reliefs depicting processions and rituals, fusing sacred art with narrative storytelling. Their writings' individual voices are among the most striking features of Sumerian culture. Clay tablets that contained family letters, prayers to the gods, and even student grievances against strict teachers have been discovered by archaeologists. These pieces show that beneath the colossal ziggurats and royal epics were regular people, merchants negotiating prices, lovers communicating affectionately across great distances, and parents concerned about their children. These kinds of texts help us remember that their aspirations and anxieties were not all that dissimilar from our own. Mesopotamia was not the only place where Sumerian myths were found. Later civilizations were influenced by the themes they propagated. Hebrew stories in Genesis were influenced by Babylonian stories such as Atrahasis, which were shaped by the flood story. Greek myths of Heracles, and even contemporary narratives, retell the Gilgamesh hero's journey, which includes friendship, loss, quest, and acceptance. Even though the Sumerians were the first to etch their tales on clay, their inquiries about what it means to be human are timeless. What do we abandon? Their creative accomplishments lasted just as long. Gold and lapis lazuli traces can still be found on yours lyres, which were interred in royal tombs alongside nobles and bear witness to exceptionally beautiful craftsmanship. The spiritual devotion of a people pleading with erratic gods is depicted in statues of worshippers with their hands clasped in perpetual prayer. Their simple yet exquisite pottery is another example of a culture that placed equal importance on form and function. Literature and the arts were inextricably linked to life in Sumer. Festivals blended dance, music, and recitation. Regal hymns blended with private prayers. Temple walls narrated myths as vividly as sung epics. Their culture had a deep emotional depth because of this blending of creativity and belief, and we are still moved by it. When we read their writings or look at their artifacts today, you can practically hear the scribe's stylus scraping wet clay. As you stand in front of a clay tablet bearing the Epic of Gilgamesh, and you can feel the weight of the questions that plagued a king 4 millennia ago. Even though the Sumerians are long gone and their cities have been destroyed, their voices are still heard in their literature and art. They describe floods and eternity, love and loss, gods and people, and the beginnings of humanity's never-ending quest for purpose. Imagine Mesopotamia's level plains glistening in the sunlight. Life-giving water from the Euphrates and Tigris is transported into meticulously prepared fields via canals that wind across the landscape. While oxen pull plows across the wet ground, farmers stoop over rows of barley and wheat. Markets bustle beyond the fields with barter and trade, involving exotic goods from far-off places that could as well be myth, clay tokens, and grain sacks. The first identifiable economy in human history began here in Sumer. Irrigation was the key to the Sumerian people's prosperity. Despite the lack of rain in southern Mesopotamia, the twin rivers flooded regularly, covering the plains with fertile silt. Sumerian farmers turned this unpredictably changing environment into a managed agricultural machine by excavating canals and dikes. Dry land could be transformed into a breadbasket that could feed thousands of people by storing and redirecting water. This invention allowed for the emergence of specialized occupations by supporting dense urban populations and relieving some residents of their farming duties. The foundation of Sumer's economy was agriculture. The main crop was barley, with dates, wheat, and flax as supplements. Sheep, goats, and cattle were examples of livestock that produced meat, milk, and wool. Cities flourished thanks to surpluses, which supported administrators, merchants, and artists who didn't have to work in the fields. A significant turning point in human history was this specialization, which allowed people to focus entirely on trade, crafts, or governance rather than just survival for the first time. Barter was the main form of exchange in these crowded cities. Shepherds traded wool for fish, potters traded textiles, and farmers traded grain for tools. However, Sumerians created clever token systems to represent goods as transactions became more intricate. Small pieces of clay, such as discs, cones, and spheres, represented amounts of oil, barley, or sheep. In order to prevent fraud and act as early receipts, these tokens were sealed inside clay envelopes known as bulla. These tokens eventually developed into written marks on tablets, opening the door for the first accounting systems and ultimately the development of writing itself. Sumer was not alone. Their traders engaged in long-distance trade that linked far-flung civilizations long before the Silk Road. Exchanges with ancient Egypt and the Indus Valley, present-day Pakistan and India, are revealed by archaeological evidence. Metals like copper and tin came from the highlands of Anatolia and Iran, while carnelian beads and exotic woods came from the Indus. Sumer reciprocated by exporting excess grain, handicrafts, and textiles. In addition to providing Sumer with economic benefits, these trade networks dispersed concepts, innovations, and cultural themes throughout continents. Social life was altered by this thriving economy. The upper echelons of Sumerian society were occupied by kings and priests, while the lower echelons were occupied by farmers, merchants, artisans, and slaves. Because they connected nearby production with far-off markets, merchants held a special place. Both envious and mistrusted, they were praised for their wealth, but closely monitored to guarantee integrity in business dealings. Their sophisticated business dealings are attested to by contracts and debt records, complete with interest rates and repayment schedules that were carved into clay tablets. The markets themselves were vibrant events. Imagine winding streets, lined with stalls offering river fish, wool clothing, and fresh dates. There was constant bargaining, with voices rising above the cries of vendors and the clatter of donkeys. Silver by weight occasionally functioned as a standard measure of value, facilitating exchanges between goods of unequal worth, even though currency as we know today did not yet exist. The foundation for subsequent monetary systems was established. By this combination of barter and proto-currency, temples served as both commercial centers and houses of worship. They managed facilities for storing excess grain, hired labor, and owned enormous swaths of land. During festivals or periods of scarcity, offerings to the gods were redistributed and served as a kind of communal wealth. The temple administration maintained exacting records, guaranteeing that both human and divine resources were properly tracked down. By combining civic and religious duties into one organization, the temple served as a bank and market regulator. In many respects, Sumer's cultural accomplishments were driven by this economic complexity. Large-scale construction projects like ziggurats, scribal schools, and trade expeditions that returned with luxury goods and novel concepts were all made possible by surplus wealth. Sumer became the first real urban civilization as a result of its prosperity, which enabled it to innovate in literature, art, and government. However, fragility was hidden beneath this prosperity. Sumer was threatened by the very irrigation systems that kept it afloat. Ill-managed canals could cause fields to become salinized, which would eventually lower fertility. Cities were susceptible to disruptions due to their reliance on long-distance trade. The delicate balance could be upset by recurring invasions or droughts, which would cause prosperous cities to collapse. Babylon and Assyria later adopted these cycles of rise and fall, which became a recurrent theme in Mesopotamian history. Nevertheless, Sumer's economic innovations have left a lasting legacy. Even today, economies are built on the foundation of recorded transactions, standardized weights, controlled irrigation, and structured marketplaces. All contemporary ledgers, contracts, and receipts can be traced back to clay tablets that were first written on 5,000 years ago. You can practically hear the commotion of ancient marketplaces when you're standing among the ruins of Ur or Lagash. You can hear donkeys prancing, metal tools clanging, and merchants counting their wares. Humanity first discovered how to feed cities, trade across continents, and accumulate wealth beyond the demands of a single season here in these sun-drenched streets. The concept of economy itself originated here. Shut your eyes and visualize your streets at their peak. Canals shimmering in the Mesopotamian sun, markets brimming with grain, and priests chanting at soaring ziggurats. Imagine those same streets centuries later, once bustling plazas that are eerily quiet, walls that are collapsing, and canals that are clogged with silt. The mud between two rivers was the birthplace of the first great civilization in history, and it would eventually return to that same mud. Even kings and gods were powerless to stop the slow unraveling of forces that led to Sumer's collapse. River changes and climate change were two of the biggest causes of Sumer's decline. The arid plains had been turned into fertile farmland for generations by meticulously maintained irrigation. However, salt was also present in the same water that supported life. Fields became less productive over centuries as a result of mineral deposits in the soil caused by frequent flooding and evaporation. Reduced harvest yields led to migration and competition for the remaining arable land. Some cities were condemned to gradual abandonment as a result of changes in the Euphrates and Tigris rivers courses, which left them stranded far from essential water sources. The conditions for external invasions were created by this environmental stress. Around 2330 BCE, Sargon the Great led the Akkadians to the north, creating one of the first empires in history. The Akkadians eventually assimilated and eclipsed their southern neighbors, despite being greatly influenced by Sumerian culture. Subsequent waves of invaders, including the Amorites and Gutians, took advantage of the vulnerable city-states and overran them one by one. Temples were looted, fields were burned, and people were uprooted as a result of each conquest. In empires they had once controlled, the once proud cities of Ur, Uruk, and Lagash were now vassals. These external pressures were exacerbated by internal divisions. Sumer was a patchwork of fiercely independent city-states, each with its own king and patron deity rather than a single cohesive kingdom. This promoted creativity and cultural diversity, but it also led to ongoing rivalries. Alliances were broken and resources were depleted by conflicts over trade routes, water rights, and religious supremacy. The leaders of Sumer betrayed one another when cooperation could have saved them, leaving the area open to attack from outside forces. Depletion of resources made the crisis worse. Population pressures increased as the amount of fertile land decreased. Stone and wood, which were already in short supply in the alluvial plain, became more difficult to come by. Conflicts in the region caused trade routes to become unstable, cutting off supplies of luxury goods and metals. Even the once prosperous temples, which had served as vital economic hubs, found it difficult to sustain their sizable estates and labor forces. The religious organizations that held society together started to wane as offerings decreased, and their authority dwindled. The great cities of Sumer were only shadows of their former glory by the beginning of the second millennium BCE. Some, like Eridu, were completely abandoned, while others managed to survive under foreign control as Babylon and other rising powers progressively assimilated their language and culture. Similar to Latin in medieval Europe, the Sumerian language itself vanished from everyday use and only survived as a scholarly and liturgical language. After being preserved in clay tablets buried under layers of dust and time, what had once been a vibrant civilization became a memory. Nevertheless, Sumer's influence persisted even after its collapse. Their legal, religious, and writing systems were passed down to the Akkadians, Babylonians, and Assyrians. Themes from myths like the Epic of Gilgamesh reverberated in later cultures, from the Hebrews to the Greeks, and were replicated for centuries. Our clocks and compasses are still based on Sumerian base 60 mathematics. The course of civilization itself was influenced by their advancements in irrigation, urban planning, and governance. Instead of marking the end of progress, the fall of Sumer marked a change and a handover of cultural traditions. Each layer of Mesopotamian history was built on top of the accomplishments of those first city builders, and their ruins served as the cornerstones for succeeding empires. In this way, Sumer never really disappeared. It is preserved in every written law, walled city, and time-marking calendar. It's difficult to imagine the busy life that occupied these streets in the past, when you're standing among the windswept mounds of ancient Ur or Lagash. However, if you look closely, you can still make out the bases of ziggurats, the outlines of canals, and the pieces of tablets bearing the first questions ever asked by humans. Despite being the first to rise and fall, the Sumerians gave us the concept of history itself. What if the first known civilization, the ones who created the first cities, wrote the first laws, and invented writing, also held mysteries we have yet to unravel? Fragments of stories that straddle the boundary between myth and history are interred in Sumerian clay tablets, suggesting forbidden knowledge that is too odd and unsettling for future generations to comprehend. This is the darker side of Sumer's history, which starts with gods living among humans, the Anunnaki, deities who are said to descend from the heavens and have authority over creation. Kingship and fate itself are the most contentious characters in Sumerian mythology. They are depicted as cosmic administrators who make decisions about mortals' fates in temple hymns. But in modern times, these same descriptions have fueled a radical theory. Were the Anunnaki not gods at all, but beings from another world? Sumerian representations of winged figures, skyboats, and heavenly tablets are cited by ancient astronaut theorists as potential proof of contact with highly developed visitors. This perspective is rejected by mainstream historians who believe that such interpretations are incorrect readings of symbolism. However, the fact that these questions still exist shows how remarkable the Sumerian imagination is. For example, why did the earliest god stories seem so technological? Then there are the lost technologies that have been mentioned in the history of forbidden things. The so-called Baghdad battery, which consists of an iron rod, copper cylinder, and clay jar found in Mesopotamia, is one of the most well-known. Some argue that, despite being dated to later eras, it reflects an even older Sumerian understanding of electricity, possibly utilized in sacred rituals or for plating metals. Others wonder how a supposedly primitive society could have achieved such accuracy by pointing to their exact astronomical records, which track planetary motions, eclipses, and star cycles long before telescopes. Did they inherit knowledge from an even older, forgotten source? Or did their priests have a genius for observation? The prohibited texts, which were either omitted or altered when later religious traditions developed, are equally thought-provoking. Sumerian tablets' creation myths and flood stories are similar to those found in Genesis, but they differ dramatically in that they feature multiple gods, contradictory motivations, and an earlier time frame. Is it possible that the modern-day biblical tales are reenactments of the much older Sumerian originals? If yes, what else was left out and why? A hero meets a man who survived a massive flood in the Epic of Gilgamesh. In Hebrew, that man is known as Noah. The similarities make one wonder how much of our sacred history may have originated in Sumer and what facts were obfuscated in the process. These concepts are hotly debated by contemporary scholars. Although Sumer's accomplishments were impressive, archaeologists maintain that human ingenuity, not secret magic or extraterrestrial intervention, was responsible for them. However, fringe researchers contend that too many anomalies, ranging from unexpected knowledge advances to out-of-place artifacts, go unaccounted for. They question who makes the decisions about what is considered history and what is written off as myth. And why do so many ancient cultures from Mesoamerica to Egypt tell of gods that teach people law, writing, and agriculture by descending from the sky? The dispute is not limited to scholarly circles. Well-known books and documentaries make assumptions about suppressed truths, accusing organizations of concealing information that might change the story of human origins. Even though many of these assertions are devoid of concrete proof, they appeal to a profound uneasiness, the feeling that our knowledge of the past is lacking, possibly on purpose. Why are so many historic sites still off-limits to visitors? Why do some artifacts disappear into the basements of museums, never to be seen again? Asterisk, the gaps are part of the mystery. Despite everything we know about Sumer, there are still a ton of untranslated tablets in the vast archives. Under the sands of the desert, entire layers of cities lie sealed and unexcavated. Every year, new discoveries cast doubt on long-held beliefs. An unexpectedly old temple, a text featuring strange gods, or a mathematical discovery that was centuries ahead of its time. Every new finding begs the question, did Sumer's knowledge come from an even older culture? Before civilization, were there civilizations? Longing is at the heart of the fascination with Sumer's forbidden side, not merely aliens or lost technology. We get the impression that these early city builders had a deep understanding of the stars, life and death, and the place of humanity in the universe. Their stories describe gods battling their own imperfections, mortals pursuing immortality, and cosmic conflicts that mirror our own hardships. These tales contain truths that are both unsettling and inspirational, even when they are devoid of dramatic assertions. Picture the wind sweeping across broken ziggurats as you stand in the ruins of yore. You pick up a piece of clay that has unreadable wedge-shaped markings on it. The memory of a people who emerged from mud to help shape civilization itself, as well as possibly hints of something more, are contained in that fragment. They were aware of something that we have either forgotten or have decided not to notice. What if the foundation of our contemporary existence, the way we keep track of time, document events, and adhere to laws, was established thousands of years ago in the dusty plains of Sumer rather than in Rome or Greece? Often without recognizing it, we carry their legacy with us every day. You are following in the footsteps of people who lived 5,000 years ago. Every time you look at a clock that is divided into 60 minutes, write your name on paper, or move through a city with well-planned streets, the most revolutionary invention in human history, writing, was brought to us by the Sumerians. Ideas were able to endure across generations thanks to their wedge-shaped cuneiform script, which transformed transient speech into permanent documentation. Writing evolved from simple grain tallies scribbled onto clay tablets to epic poetry, holy hymns, and legal codes that influenced societies long after Sumer's collapse. A piece of that initial spark is present in every book you hold and every message you send. They were also forerunners in the fields of law and government, bringing the notion that justice could be expressed in writing as opposed to orally. Fairness and accountability were established by the Code of Urnamu. These ideas were later mirrored in Babylon, Rome, and contemporary constitutions. In these early city-states, when kings asserted divine authority while still carving their decrees into clay for public viewing, the idea that rulers themselves are subject to the law originated. We still use their timekeeping and math. There are 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, and 360 degrees in a circle, thanks to the Sumerian base 60 system. The principles that astronomers first documented are still used today to map the heavens. Farmers continue to use calendars they created by observing the stars to determine seasonal cycles. Those early sky watchers are responsible for the very rhythm of our days waking, working, and celebrating. Beyond useful inventions, Sumer influenced the narratives we tell about ourselves. Later religions and literatures have echoed their myths of great floods, valiant quests, and gods that live among humans. Themes of friendship, death, and the pursuit of meaning that permeate human art are all foreshadowed in the Epic of Gilgamesh. Sumerian archetypes such as the flawed hero, the divine council, and the desire for immortality are still used in contemporary novels and movies. In a sense, their shadow still exists in our imaginations. Nevertheless, despite all of their accomplishments, Sumer cities finally became quiet. Their language dissolved into ceremonial chant, walls collapsed, and canals dried up. With successive layers of dust and conquest, history buried them until nothing was left but ruins. To remind us that human greatness is brittle and that every civilization thinks it will last forever until it doesn't. Modern archaeology was necessary to discover their existence. This is the point at which Sumer's tale most urgently resonates with us today. We too reside in tall cities and are secure in our systems and technologies. We also think that what we know is permanent. But the reminder that nothing is impervious to time is whispered by the ruins of Ur and Uruk. Even the greatest civilizations can fade into obscurity as they rise and fall. Maybe one day someone will stand over the wreckage of our skyscrapers and ask Sumer the same questions we do now. Who were they? What did they think? What caused them to fall? However, this cycle also offers consolation. Sumer fell, but its ideas survived. These seeds, writing, law, and timekeeping spread into later societies and reseeded in Babylon, Greece, and other places. Legacy is knowledge that has been passed down, not walls or monarchs. Above all, Sumer provided us with a beginning that never really came to an end. Take a moment to reflect as you listen to this tale of clay tablets and ziggurats, of gods and mortals, of rise and fall. Examine your surroundings, including the language you use, the rules you abide by, and the numbers you keep track of. You are living in the future of Sumer in innumerable unseen ways. And maybe someone will live in ours someday. Please share this journey if these reminders of humanity's first chapter touched you. To help uncover more lost tales, subscribe to Ancient Echoes. If you would like to contribute to the preservation of this history, please consider making a super thanks donation. The past is still there. We just need to pay attention to it. What if everything we know about ourselves, including the laws we follow, the words we write, and the cities we traverse, is actually a loan from a people whose names have all but vanished over time? The history of Sumer is not merely about the first civilization. It is also about the first time that people ventured to create something more than a means of subsistence, something that would endure forever. We have traversed their cities, Uruk, Ur, and Eridu, where the flat plains were surrounded by mud brick walls that rose like mountains. We have stood next to their ziggurats, where priests prayed in hushed tones to the earthly and celestial gods. We have seen their scribes transform ephemeral ideas into history by pressing reeds into moist clay. We have also discovered how profoundly their imagination continues to influence our own sacred stories by tracing their myths of floods, heroes, and divine councils into our own. From law codes to literature, from astronomy to agriculture, the Sumerians ignited a spark that fueled all subsequent civilizations. They provided us with the power of written memory, the rhythm of time, and the blueprint for cities. Their ideas persisted even after their own culture was destroyed by the Akkadians, assimilated by the Babylonians, and buried under the sand. They are present in our alphabets, calendars, and creation and lost narratives. Asterisk, however, there is a question associated with this legacy that we cannot overlook. What does it say about us if even Sumer, with all its genius, could disappear into silence? Do we have any more permanence? Will archaeologists of the future sort through our skyscrapers' debris in the same manner that we do now? Will they question what deities we revered, what anxieties we harbored, and why we thought we would live forever? A challenge to reconsider. Our understanding of history and ourselves is whispered by the Sumerian ruins. Though civilizations come and go, ideas endure. The greatest monument we can erect is memory itself, as the Sumerian clay tablets remind us. And that memory starts with the human desire to comprehend, to document, to inquire, why not with monarchs or conquests. This is the invitation. Are you going to pay attention to the echoes of the first city builders? Will you challenge the narratives you were taught and seek out the hidden truths? The past belongs to all of us and is just waiting to be rediscovered. Museums do not own it. Don't stop here if this exploration of humanity's first chapter has sparked something inside of you. To help us continue uncovering the lost facts of our history, please subscribe to Ancient Echoes. Share this story and give us a super thank you, because this marks the beginning of our history, not just theirs.